Thank you very much, Susan and the SOC, for the kind invitation to speak to you all today about our JWST program. So we are going to be using the James Webb Space Telescope in Cycle 1 to look into the atmosphere of the first transiting exoplanet discovered around a white dwarf. And as I'll get into today, there's a lot of really cool scientific reasons why we want to study this particular planet. Not least of which, this will be the first time that we will get an indication of what happens to planets after their stars die. So I find that this program, it kind of has a poetic angle to it as well as the scientific angle, in that this is truly a question that we often ask as kids: what will happen to planets after our own sun dies? So let's get into it, and I'll start by providing a very brief kind of overview of exoplanet science and kind of the landscape of what we're going to do with JWST to put this in context. So when we look at our own solar system, which was all that we knew about planets in our galaxy before the 1990s, you can immediately see a dichotomy in that there are 4 terrestrial planets orbiting close to the Sun, and then giant planets further out. So from the sample size of 1 that we had of planetary systems before we discovered exoplanets, this looked like it was already telling us something about the mechanisms via which planets form. You have to have terrestrial planets close to a star and giant planets further out. We now know, of course, that this is not the case. We have found many giant exoplanets orbiting incredibly close to their host star. So this just generally shows something that we will probably repeatedly see with JWST observations of exoplanet atmospheres, that whenever you go beyond a sample size of 1 and into a new regime of parameter space, there's always surprises waiting for you. So as to why it took until the 90s to find exoplanets, if you imagine looking at a field of stars in the nighttime sky and zooming in on a particular star, unfortunately, stars dramatically outshine their attendant planets. If you imagine an alien astronomer looking for the Earth, for example, the reflected light from the Earth is outshined by about a factor of 10 billion by the Sun. So direct imaging of planets is incredibly difficult technologically. It can be done for very young planetary systems in very wide orbits, so planets around about 100 million years old in the infrared. But the vast majority of planets that we have discovered to date have come from transits. So these tend to be very short period, close-in exoplanets that can have orbital periods, so years lasting a handful of days or so, or even hours. And if the system happens to be aligned just right, such that we see the planet transit in front of the star, some of the light from the star is obscured by the planet, and generally speaking, the size of this dip is given by the ratio of the size of the planet to the size of the star. So we can use the fraction of the light blocked during a transit to measure the size of the planet. So in this nice animation by Hugh Osborne, we'll see our state of knowledge of all planets in our galaxy as a function of time. So as we approach the 1900s, you'll see Pluto briefly appear down here. Here we go, there it is, it will disappear in the 2000s. But watch in the 90s. So the first exoplanets start to be discovered, but we see the transit revolution will come in the early 2000s, especially with the launch of the Kepler Space Telescope in 2009, filling in this huge region of parameter space with many transiting planets. So this is a summary of our current knowledge of the masses and radii of the exoplanet population compared to our solar system. So we see on the right here that many of the exoplanets that have been discovered to date are very different from the planets we see in our own solar system. So they have a much shorter year, lasting just days instead of, a year for Earth or many years for Jupiter and Saturn. So in the top left corner here, we have a population that we call the hot Jupiters. So these are planets around about the size of Jupiter and Saturn, but because they orbit far closer than Mercury, they have temperatures of 1,000 degrees or higher. There's a population of planets that kind of fill in the gap between Earth and Neptune in terms of their sizes. We call these super Earths or mini Neptunes. We have found planets that potentially are analogous to Earth, Venus, and Mars. And in the top right, which is the population that I will be focusing on today with our program, is the so-called cool giants. So these are planets that have around about the same year or orbital semi-major axis as Jupiter and Saturn, and so can help to connect the exoplanet population with the giant planets in our own solar system. So if we want to go beyond just knowing the size of a planet and its mass, and we actually want to figure out how the planet formed, how it evolved, and various other properties of the evolutionary history, we need to go beyond masses and radii and measure the composition of the atmosphere. And if a planet turns out to transit, we can actually exploit the transit to learn something about the composition of the atmosphere. And the way we do this is that during a transit, some of the light from the star passes through the atmosphere of the planet. And since different molecules and atoms or ions absorb different wavelengths of light, we can exploit this fact during a transit to extract information on which molecules are in the atmosphere and how abundant each of these chemical species are. The way this manifests, if you will, is if you imagine during a transit observing 3 different wavelengths in the infrared, such as we will be able to do with JWST. If you observe a wavelength of light, let's say at 2.3 microns, shown in orange in this animation, if there is a molecule that strongly absorbs at 2.3 microns, the planet's atmosphere appears to effectively have a slightly larger size. So the transit depth will be greater than if you observe at a wavelength where the atmosphere is relatively transparent, like at 2.1 microns here. So by scanning through a range of wavelengths in the infrared and comparing how the absorption of the atmosphere differs at different wavelengths, with a database of absorption features of different chemical species, for which we know from laboratory measurements or from theoretical quantum mechanics calculations exactly which wavelength different molecules absorb at, we can extract from a spectrum seen by JWST what the composition of the atmosphere is. So where we are at the moment is that, generally speaking, the smaller a planet is and the colder a planet is, the much harder it is to use this technique called transmission spectroscopy to characterize its atmosphere. The reason for that is if the planet blocks out a smaller fraction of the light from the star, we need a much higher collecting area and more observational time to get a strong signal. And the colder the planet is, the smaller its atmosphere is, so it also obscures less of the stellar surface. So where we are at the moment with the Hubble Space Telescope is we have been able to detect atmospheres for roughly 50 exoplanets, mainly the hot Jupiter population. So here I'm showing the size of the planets in Earth radii versus an estimate of their temperature on the x-axis. And these green pluses here show every planet for which we have detected a molecule in their atmosphere to date. So they tend to cluster in the hot Jupiter population up here, but we have a handful of detections of water vapor in the atmospheres of Neptune-sized planets. And one of the things that will be done with a number of JWST Cycle 1 programs will be to push down on this plot into the terrestrial regime. But what we are hoping to do with our JWST program is to push to the left on this diagram and directly connect the exoplanet population with the cool giants like Jupiter and Saturn. So ordinarily, this is an incredibly challenging thing to do, because a planet that has a temperature around the temperature of Jupiter, just 100 Kelvin, has such a small atmosphere that around normal main sequence stars, even JWST would not be able to achieve the sensitivity to do this very effectively. And this is where a very particular type of planet that was discovered last year comes in, that is the focus of our program. So let me introduce you to you a little bit about WD 1856b, which is the focus of our program. This is the first intact giant planet to be discovered transiting a white dwarf star. A white dwarf being the leftover core of a star that once would have been like our own sun, but has already evolved into a red giant, thrown off its outer layers, and just left this tiny stellar remnant. So this planet was discovered initially by TESS last year by Andrew van der Berg and collaborators, published in Nature. And there are so many truly bizarre things about this system, not least of which, because white dwarf stars are so tiny, they're only around about the size of Earth. This planet, which is about the size of Jupiter, is 8 times larger than the star that it orbits. So in the discovery paper, what was found is that the planet actually blocks out around 56% of the light from its host star. And the only reason that it doesn't obscure all of the light from its star is that the planet transits kind of slightly off axis at an angle. So it sweeps over part of the star instead of all of the star, which is very fortunate for us because this will help us to characterize the atmosphere. So just from the fact that this planet exists, it already tells us some fascinating things about what happens to planets after their stars die. Firstly, we know that it's possible for an intact giant planet to exist on an orbit that is 50 times closer than Mercury orbits our own sun. And this also tells us that the planet could not have formed where it presently is. The reason for this is that if you turn back the clock to when this star was on the main sequence, when it became a red giant, it would have engulfed the current orbit of WD 856b, and so the planet would have been destroyed. So we believe the planet must have originally resided on a much wider orbit around its star, perhaps around about where Jupiter and Saturn are right now. And via some mechanism, it must have migrated after the red giant phase to its current close-in orbit. Now, in the last year, many theory papers have come out to try and explain how the planet reached its present-day orbit. Some scenarios that have been proposed involve common envelope evolution, the Kozai-Lidov effect, secular chaos. We don't yet know which mechanism is at play, but that is where our JWST program comes in. We are planning to measure the composition of the atmosphere of this planet in order to, A, figure out via measuring the molecules in the atmosphere, can they tell us something about how the planet formed and how it evolved by constraining the different ratios of various elements in the atmosphere? And we also hope to measure the mass of this planet, because from the discovery paper of this planet, all that we know is that the mass of the planet is less than 14 times the mass of Jupiter. And since various evolutionary mechanisms are sensitive to the mass of the planet, a precise measurement of the planet's mass can help us narrow down the range of possibilities for how this planet survived the death of its star. So we have already begun reconnaissance of the atmosphere of this planet even before JWST launches. So in this paper that was recently accepted in the Astronomical Journal led by CE Zhu, we obtained 10 transits from the ground using Gemini GMOS of this planet's atmosphere, and then coupled with models. So this is entirely to scale in the bottom left here, showing the size of the planet relative to its star. We have developed models accounting for the fact that as the fraction of the planet's atmosphere coating its star changes throughout the transit, the size of the absorption features of the atmosphere also change with time. So just modelling this planet is very different from how we normally treat exoplanet atmospheres. And what we found was we didn't detect any molecules from the ground because it's very hard to make these measurements given the low temperature of the planet. But from the fact that we had non-detections of various molecules, we were able to place a lower limit on the mass of the planet. So currently we know the planet could be anything from about the mass of Jupiter up to 14 times the mass of Jupiter. So this is an improvement, but really we will need the precise spectra that will come from JWST to narrow down this range and tell us something about how this planet reached its present-day orbit. So what we expect to see with JWST is we will really be aided by the infrared coverage. Because thus far from the ground, we have probed the range from up to about 0.9 microns, so the leftmost range that we see on this model plot here. In the infrared, there are much more prominent features from methane and ammonia that we would expect to see if the atmosphere of this planet resembles that of Jupiter, and there are also weaker features from water vapor and maybe even phosphine from disequilibrium chemistry. So with the 4 transits that we will observe with the NIRSPEC prism with JWST, this is roughly what we are expecting to see. So if the mass of the planet is around about 3 times the mass of Jupiter, which is a little higher than what we expect to see based on the radius of the planet, via an atmospheric retrieval analysis, we have concluded that we can confidently detect methane and ammonia in the atmosphere, and contingent on the mass of the planet, we should also be able to back out water and potentially phosphine. And by retrieving these features, we expect to be able to place precise measurements on the abundances of definitely methane and ammonia, and potentially water and phosphine, depending on how abundant they are in the atmosphere. And the reason this is exciting is that at the cold temperature of this planet, these molecules should be the dominant carriers of nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, and phosphorus. So by detecting these molecules and constraining their abundances to within a factor of 2 or better, we, for the first time, will have, for an exoplanet atmosphere, 4 simultaneous measurements of the elemental abundance ratios. And this should provide some quite precise constraints that we will be able to use to narrow down the parameter space on how the planet originally formed, migrated, and evolved to its current orbit, since the evolutionary history of the planet influences the relative ratios of these different elements. So if a planet, for example, accretes icy planetesimals, that can increase the oxygen to hydrogen abundance by adding more water, for example. And via the amplitudes of these features, we will also be able to constrain the mass of the planet to within potentially 0.2 Jupiter masses, which should be sufficient for us to discriminate between these different formation scenarios. So the last thing that I want to emphasize here is that since this is the first transiting planet around a white dwarf, if we find more transiting planets around white dwarfs in the future, this is really just a pathfinder for what we will be able to do with JWST in future cycles. And in particular, one avenue that I'm quite excited by is the prospect of terrestrial rocky planets around white dwarfs. We haven't found any of these planets yet, but if we do find one of these planets, and this is something that TESS is actually already looking for at the moment. Andrew Vanderberg has a TESS Cycle 4 program searching for these planets. A notional rocky planet transiting a white dwarf would obscure half of the light from its host star, and consequently it would have very strong absorption features in its transmission spectrum. So last year, Lisa Kautnager and I put out a study examining if we found one of these planets, how easy would it be to detect various different molecules in the atmosphere? And what we found is that even a medium JWST program could confidently detect biosignatures like methane and ozone in the atmosphere. So one thing I hope is that this program that we will do looking at a Jupiter-sized planet in Cycle 1 can help lay the groundwork for characterizing rocky planets in the habitable zone of white dwarfs if we do find them in the years to come. So with that, I'll be happy to take some questions, and I'd like to thank all of my co-investigators on this program.
There's already a couple coming up, and the first is by Bill Blair, who asks, he wants to know what the surface temperature of the white dwarf star is.
So this particular white dwarf surface temperature, it's around about the temperature of the sun. So what about, off the top of my head, I think it's like 5,600 Kelvin or so. But yeah, so roughly solar temperature. So It's been cooling for a couple billion years, suffice it to say.
That actually feeds into one of the questions I had, was whether you had to worry about the light from the white dwarf being significantly different than you're used to having hitting the planet when you're modeling the atmospheres. But I guess if it's 5,000 Kelvin, it's not a whole lot different than other planets' atmospheres you've modeled. Is that true, or?
Well, it's tricky. There's, I mean, some of the co-investigators that we have here are experts in photochemical modelling in case we do encounter strange species in the atmosphere, because we do see, even in the atmosphere of Jupiter, which you would not necessarily expect to have much photochemistry given its wide orbital separation, there are photochemical hazes seen that absorbing in the reflection spectrum of Jupiter. So the spectrum of the star, especially being different from that of the Sun in terms of it being a white dwarf, probably will lead to some very different atmospheric components, especially at the short wavelengths. But one thing we did especially have to deal with that's less to do with the spectrum, but more to do with the dim magnitude of the host star.
Mm.
That was both a blessing and a curse, because on the one hand, because this star is so dim, and I've forgotten off the top of my head the magnitude, but it's I will check that. It's either 15th or 17th magnitude or so. It's so dim that on the one hand, that helps us because we can observe the entire 0.6 to 5 micron spectrum with the NIRSPEC prism. But the fact that the planet occults 50% of the light from the star compensates for the fact that the star is just so much dimmer than the stars we would usually target with JWST. So yeah, white dwarfs are an interesting case, and when I take the next question, I will actually find the precise magnitude of this star.
That's okay. But yeah, so the next question is from Jinmi Yoon, and she's asking, is there a chance that the planet captured some of the host star's ejected materials during the evolution as the star evolved off the main sequence? So is there a chance the planet's atmosphere contaminated by the host star's composition and dust and such? Will that play into, I assume, your understanding of its evolution?
That's certainly a possibility, and that would describe what we would see in the common envelope evolution theory for how the planet migrated to its present close-in orbit. So we would expect, if the planet had been contaminated by the composition of the star, for it to resemble roughly the composition of the white dwarf. Sorry, not the white dwarf, but the perhaps an original solar composition. So yes, that's a possibility. One of the clues that might happen would be if the mass of the planet has been significantly enhanced by the contamination from the wind, for example. So if the mass of the planet is much greater than 3 times the mass of Jupiter, we probably won't expect to detect much from the transmission spectrum. But fortunately that we have there is a complementary program that will be observing the emission spectrum of this planet as well in Cycle 1, led by Andrew van der Berg. And if the planet has a higher mass and hence a much higher temperature, the emission in the infrared will be much stronger. So effectively, my program will be focused on the parameter space with low masses, and in case the planet has a much higher mass than we expect, Andrew van der Berg's program will be much more sensitive. So between the two programs, we should be able to figure out the mass of the planet and, hence cover both of those. So yeah. There's a lot more modelling that we still have to do. This is a very enigmatic and weird system. So we haven't figured it out all yet. But if we do find something weird, we'll definitely have to keep our eyes open for what the composition is. Because at the moment, we're mainly assuming this planet will be analogous to Jupiter. Of course, the post-main sequence evolution could have done something very strange to the atmosphere.
Thank you for that. It was very clear. Scott Fleming is asking, is capture from a binary companion one survival mechanism for a planet orbiting this close to a remnant? Are there any observables that could constrain this mechanism if so?
Right. I'm not sure about that particular question. I mean, in the discovery paper for this planet, so there are a couple reasonably close companion stars that could have influenced the evolution of this planet. As far as I'm aware, I've not seen anyone look into the question of whether the planet could have been captured from binary, so we'd have to look into that. Incidentally, I found the magnitude. It's 15.7th magnitude in J band. So yeah, the star's pretty dim.
Record for the dimmest star that JWST is going to, or dimmest planet hosting star, maybe. JWST will observe, potentially. Okay, Emily Rickman asks, she says, thanks for the great talk, Ryan. Do we have an idea of what the occurrence rate of surviving planets are around white dwarfs? Can we expect to find more such planets in the near future? You might also comment in terms of the transit method, what the odds are that it would actually, an Earth-sized planet would transit. That's another question I have.
Yep. So at least for rocky planets, there's only limits at the moment since we haven't found one. I recall there was an upper limit placed a couple of years ago of maybe about 25% for the occurrence rate, and obviously it will fall with this survey. The transit probability is actually not too dissimilar from M dwarfs. So even though this host star is much smaller, you're compensated by the fact that the habitable zone is much, much closer. So the two factors almost exactly counteract to give you about a 1% transit probability. So we did a back of the envelope calculation in the paper that Lisa Kaltnager and I wrote, estimating that if the occurrence rate is similar to what we see for rocky planets around M stars, we might expect to find about 6 or so of these rocky planets around white dwarfs within the characterization horizon of JWST. But obviously, if it's much, much lower than that, we might not find them. So it's very much still an outstanding question.
Thank you for those absolutely clear responses, Ryan. That was an excellent talk. I really enjoyed that. Learned a lot.
Thanks for your questions, everyone.